Welcome, dear listener, and tonight we drift back into the past, where history becomes a story whispered beneath the stars. As you settle into rest, let your body grow heavy, your breath deepen, and your mind soften, for we are about to journey together into another time. The world outside can wait. Tonight, only the quiet rhythm of words remains. Close your eyes, if you wish, and imagine yourself stepping gently into the pages of history, where echoes of lives long ago move like shadows across the snow, where voices of determination and dreams linger in the silent air. This is not a lecture nor a lesson, but a gentle passage into the past, told slowly, softly, so that every detail carries you deeper into calm. So let go now, allow the day to fade, and come with me as we drift back into the age of the Klondike Gold Rush, and the story of how gold seekers braved the deadliest trail in history. Close your eyes and let your body sink deeper into rest. Tonight, we are traveling far back in time, to an age when whispers carried faster than wind, when the promise of gold set entire nations trembling with excitement, and when hope was so strong that people abandoned everything they knew to chase a dream glittering just beyond the horizon. The year was 1896, and the place was the remote northern reaches of the Yukon, a wild land of snow, rivers, forests, and silence, a land untouched by most of the outside world. Yet it was here, in that frozen wilderness, that gold was discovered, and with that discovery began one of the greatest migrations in history, the Klondike Gold Rush. The story begins quietly, almost humbly, as so many great stories do. A few prospectors, hardened by years of searching, stumbled upon gold along a tributary of the Klondike River. The news at first was local, shared only in small towns, whispered between men who trusted one another, and kept secret by those who feared the competition that discovery would bring. But secrets never stay buried for long. Word escaped, carried first by letters, then by newspapers, and finally by rumor. And soon the world was listening. The whispers became louder, and by 1897 the cry had spread across continents. There was gold in the Klondike, more gold than anyone had ever dreamed, gold lying just beneath the soil, waiting to be scooped up by the first to arrive. For ordinary men and women, this news struck like lightning. At the time, much of the world was caught in hardship. The United States had endured a deep economic depression only a few years before. Banks had failed, factories had closed, and countless families were left without work, without income, and without hope. In crowded cities, men looked at their calloused hands and wondered what their lives would become. Farmers watched their crops fail and their debts grow heavier with each season. Laborers worked long hours for little pay, trapped in cycles of poverty that seemed impossible to break. And then, suddenly, there was this miracle, this shining opportunity from the frozen north. A chance to escape, a chance to be rich beyond imagination, a chance to start life anew. To men who had nothing, to women who dreamed of more, the Klondike was not just gold in the earth. It was gold in the heart. It was the possibility of freedom. Imagine the conversations that filled the air in those days. In small towns, men gathered in saloons, their voices hushed but trembling with excitement. Someone would say, "Did you hear? They struck gold up in the Yukon." And another would reply, "I heard a man filled his pockets in a single day." Rumors grew wilder with every telling. Some claimed the rivers themselves gleamed with gold dust. Others swore that nuggets as large as fists could be plucked from the ground. No one truly knew the truth, but in a way, the truth hardly mattered. The dream was enough. The idea of fortune was stronger than fact, and it spread like fire, unstoppable. Ships leaving Alaska carried miners back to San Francisco, Seattle, and other ports, and on those ships were men whose pockets jingled with gold, their faces sunburned and weary, but their hands heavy with wealth. When the first ships arrived in Seattle in July 1897, carrying nearly 2 tons of gold, pandemonium broke out. The docks overflowed with people, the newspapers rushed to print bold headlines, and the city erupted into fever. Crowds gathered to see the returning prospectors, to touch their treasure, to hear their stories. It was a spectacle that could not be ignored. Within hours, the word had spread across America and beyond. The Klondike Gold Rush had begun in earnest. For those who heard the news, the choice seemed clear: stay in the life they knew, grinding away in hardship, or leave everything behind for a chance at glory. And so, countless thousands chose to leave. Men kissed their families goodbye, promising to return with wealth. Women packed what they could and resolved to follow. Young boys lied about their age, desperate to join the adventure. Shopkeepers closed their doors, clerks abandoned their ledgers, and farmers left their fields. They sold their belongings or mortgaged their futures to buy passage north. The fever was not limited to America alone. From Europe, from Australia, from every corner of the world, the dreamers came. They were bound together by a vision that was as fragile as smoke and as powerful as fire. Now, pause for a moment and picture the scene in your mind. Imagine standing on the crowded streets of Seattle in 1897 as the news spread like a storm. The air is thick with excitement. Men shout offers for supplies. Merchants raise prices overnight, for they know what is coming. Steamships line the docks, their funnels pouring out smoke, their decks piled with crates and barrels. You hear the creak of ropes, the calls of sailors, the chatter of eager passengers who have bought their tickets with their last savings. The smell of salt water mixes with coal smoke and the faint aroma of food carried by the wind from market stalls, and everywhere there is that same electric feeling, the sense that something extraordinary is about to happen. The Klondike is calling, and thousands are ready to answer. But as they stood there, with their dreams burning bright, few understood the reality that awaited them. They thought of gold, endless gold, lying waiting to be taken. They did not think of the distance. They did not think of the mountains. They did not think of the bitter cold or the deadly silence of the northern wilderness. They did not think of the trail. For the trail itself, long before they even reached the gold fields, would prove to be the greatest test of their lives. Yet that was still to come. For now, in the hearts of those who dreamed, there was only hope. And hope in those days was a powerful thing. It carried men beyond reason. It drove them to risk everything, to endure anything, simply for the chance of something more. And so they prepared. They packed supplies, warm clothing, boots, tents, cooking gear, tools, blankets, food enough to last, or so they thought. They stood in line at outfitters, purchasing sacks of flour, beans, bacon, and coffee. They bought axes and saws, ropes and lanterns, rifles for hunting, and shovels for digging. Each man imagined himself striking rich. Each woman pictured herself living in comfort, and all believed that the hardships would be temporary, that the gold would make every sacrifice worthwhile. And as they prepared, stories swirled through the air, stories of men who had already struck it rich, stories of fortunes made overnight, tales of nuggets gleaming in the sunlight, of pans filled with dust after only minutes of work. These stories may have been exaggerated, but they burned in the imagination. They created visions that could not be forgotten. At night, men lay awake dreaming of their new lives, and in the morning, they set out to make those dreams real. The fever had them now. There was no turning back. The ships filled quickly, every berth sold, every cabin packed with men who had never before seen the North. Crowds cheered from the docks as the steamers pulled away, the sound of whistles echoing across the water. The passengers stood on deck, their faces a mix of excitement and fear, waving farewell to the lives they were leaving behind. Some sang songs, their voices lifted against the wind. Others stood silent, their thoughts heavy with what lay ahead. The ocean stretched before them, vast and unknown, carrying them toward destiny. The gold lay far beyond, hidden in mountains and rivers, waiting for those who dared. As the ships moved northward, the passengers told stories to one another, each trying to imagine what awaited them. Some spoke of quick riches, others warned of danger. A few had read accounts from explorers and trappers, and their words painted pictures of snowstorms, avalanches, and bitter cold. But still, even with these warnings, most smiled and shrugged. They believed their determination would be enough. They believed the gold would be waiting, just as the stories said. The human mind is quick to hope and slower to fear, and so they pressed onward, carried not only by steam and steel, but by the beating pulse of desire. And here, dear listener, we pause, letting the waves of history wash gently over us, for this was only the beginning. The gold rushers did not yet know the mountains that would rise before them, or the weight of the loads they would carry, or the snow that would bury the trail. They did not yet know of the countless steps, the endless trips, the aching muscles, or the icy winds that cut to the bone. They did not yet know how many would fail and how few would succeed. For now there was only the call of gold, ringing like a bell across the world, echoing in the hearts of men and women who longed for a different life. Let your mind drift over those faces, the hopeful and the desperate, the strong and the weak, all boarding their ships, all setting out toward the unknown. Feel the weight of their dreams, the fire in their hearts, the courage and the recklessness mixed together. For in those days, the Klondike was not just a place on a map. It was an idea, a promise, a dream of something brighter. And it was enough to send thousands into the wild, where only the strongest would endure. The gold seekers had left behind the crowded docks of Seattle and San Francisco, the noise of cities and the warmth of familiar lives. They had crossed cold waters and sailed into unknown harbors, carrying with them supplies, hope, and the restless fire of dreams. But when they finally reached the edge of Alaska and prepared to march inland, they faced the first true wall that stood between them and their fortune. That wall was not built by men. It was carved by nature, steep and merciless. It was the Chilkoot Trail. The Chilkoot was not just a path. It was a mountain corridor, a frozen staircase rising high into the clouds, where snow and ice swallowed the land, where avalanches rolled like thunder, and where silence itself seemed heavy, as if the air carried the weight of every broken dream left upon its slopes. Those who stood at the base of the trail looked upward, their eyes tracing the jagged climb ahead, and for the first time many of them felt the sharp cut of doubt. It was not a trail for the faint of heart. It was not even truly a trail at all. It was a gauntlet, and to pass through it would demand strength, endurance, and a kind of stubbornness that bordered on madness. Imagine yourself standing there in their place. The year is 1897. The sky above is gray, the air thin with the promise of snow. Around you, hundreds of men mill about, their boots sinking into the slush, their breath rising in pale clouds. Some are tightening straps around heavy packs. Others are tending to mules and sled dogs. Everywhere there is noise, the clatter of pots, the creak of leather harnesses, the sharp calls of voices urging animals forward. Yet beneath it all is a nervous energy, an undercurrent of fear that no one speaks aloud. The mountain looms ahead, and everyone knows that to climb it is to risk everything. The Canadian government had demanded that every gold seeker bring with him a year's worth of supplies, nearly 1 ton in weight. Flour, bacon, beans, coffee, clothing, tents, tools, axes, saws, rifles, lanterns, rope, shovels, every item stacked into crates and sacks, every crate lashed to sleds or carried on aching shoulders. No man could carry it all at once. So they carried it piece by piece, load by load, up and down the trail. Imagine trudging through snow that rises to your knees, carrying 50 or 60 pounds strapped to your back, climbing upward along steep slopes slick with ice. You reach a cache, drop the load, mark the place with a stick or a flag, and then turn back down for another load. Then you climb again, over and over, sometimes a dozen times, sometimes 20, until every pound of that 1-ton burden has been inched forward along the trail. The Chilkoot was only 33 miles long, but for many it took weeks, even months, to conquer it. Step by step, mile by mile, the dreamers became beasts of burden, hauling their futures on their backs. Boots wore thin, muscles tore, hands froze around wooden shafts, and all the while the mountain stood indifferent, its slopes blanketed in snow so white it hurt the eyes, its silence broken only by the groan of avalanches rolling down unseen ridges. At night, the camps were filled with the sound of weary men collapsing beside their fires, too tired to speak. Some stirred beans in blackened pots, their hands shaking from fatigue. Others sat silently, staring into the flames, the weight of doubt pressing heavily upon their hearts. They asked themselves, though often only in silence, whether the dream of gold was worth this torment. But dawn always came, and with it the pull of hope. And so they rose, strapped on their packs, and began again. The most infamous stretch of the Chilkoot was the final climb, known as the Golden Stairs. Here, the slope rose so steeply that steps had to be cut into the ice, an endless ladder of snow that reached toward the clouds. Men climbed single file, their packs pressing heavily into their shoulders, their boots slipping on frozen rungs. The line of gold seekers stretched like a living chain up the mountain, a line so long that from a distance it resembled an ant trail crawling across the white face of the earth. One step, another, then another, dozens of trips, hundreds of steps. Each movement was agony, each pause risked losing your place in the long, slow procession, and yet, despite the danger, there was a strange beauty in it. The mountain glowed pale under the winter sun, the snow glittered like crushed diamonds, and the air was sharp and clean. For a moment, standing there, you might forget the pain, the hunger, the fear. You might look out across the endless horizon and feel the enormity of the land, the wild, untamed world that stretched in every direction. You might even feel small, and yet part of something greater, part of the great human tide pushing against nature itself. Still, the beauty could not hide the risk. Avalanches struck without warning, sweeping away men, animals, and supplies in seconds. Snow buried everything, erasing the trail as if it had never been. The wind howled so fiercely that it cut through wool and fur, leaving frostbite on exposed skin. Some men froze where they fell, their bodies later discovered by others who climbed the same path, their faces pale masks in the snow. The trail claimed lives daily, and those who survived carried the memory of what they had seen, the knowledge that fortune was never guaranteed. And yet they climbed. They climbed because the dream was stronger than the fear. They climbed because they believed that just beyond the ridge, beyond the icy walls of the Chilkoot, the rivers ran rich with gold. They climbed because turning back meant surrender, and surrender was unthinkable. Step by step, load by load, mile by mile, they fought the mountain, and in doing so they fought themselves, pushing past limits they never knew existed. The Canadian government had made one demand of every man who dreamed of the Klondike. They required that each prospector carry with him a full year's supply of food, tools, and clothing. It was not a suggestion, nor a guideline. It was law. The authorities in the Yukon knew the wilderness better than those who now swarmed north. They knew the hunger that could grip a camp in the depths of winter. They knew the way starvation could break even the strongest spirit. And so they insisted, 1 ton of supplies per man, enough to keep him alive for 12 long months. At first, the gold seekers thought of it as a safeguard, an inconvenience perhaps, but a small price to pay for the riches that lay ahead. But when the weight of that ton was strapped to their backs, when the straps cut into their shoulders and their knees buckled under the load, they realized the truth. The law was not a suggestion. It was a burden that defined their journey. Imagine the piles of gear that stretched along the trailheads, sacks of flour stacked high and dusted white by the wind, barrels of bacon, their salty smell thick in the air, bags of beans and rice, their seams straining against the weight. Coffee, tea, sugar, dried fruit, and hard biscuits, all measured out with precision. Then came the tools, shovels, picks, pans for washing gold, axes for cutting wood, saws for building shelters. There were tents of canvas, heavy and stiff with frost, blankets and furs, ropes, lanterns, stoves, rifles and ammunition, for the wilderness was full of bears and wolves as well as men. Every prospector's load was a mountain in itself, and each mountain had to be carried over the Chilkoot, step by step. No man could carry it all at once. Most could manage 50 or 60 pounds per trip. Some stronger souls could carry more, but none could bear the ton in one journey, and so the back and forth began. Up the slope with one load, down again for the next, a mile forward, a mile back, always climbing, always returning, always moving in an endless cycle of effort. To cover 33 miles of trail, some men walked hundreds of miles in total, their boots sinking into snow and mud, their muscles groaning under the repetition. Picture the line of men stretched along the frozen path, each bent under a pack, each step heavy and deliberate. The trail was not smooth. It was jagged and uneven, cut by rocks, coated in ice, softened by thawing snow. The loads slipped from shoulders, spilling flour into the drifts, scattering tools across the ground. Men cursed as they bent to gather what they could, for every ounce mattered. Every ounce had to be carried onward, no matter how small. The work was slow, painfully slow. Some men took weeks to move their supplies a single mile. They cached their goods along the way, building small towers of crates and sacks, marking them with flags or branches so they would not be lost beneath fresh snow. Each cache was a victory, proof that they had conquered another small piece of the journey. But each cache was also a reminder of how far remained. For every load delivered, 10 more waited behind. At night, the camps along the trail flickered with firelight. Men sat slumped against their packs, too tired to speak. The sound of the wind filled the silence, broken only by the crackle of flames and the occasional bark of a dog. Some stirred pots of beans over the fire, the smell drifting through the cold. Others gnawed at hard biscuits, chewing slowly, their jaws as weary as their legs. And still others stared into the distance, their eyes heavy with exhaustion, their minds drifting to the gold that lay ahead. The law of a ton of supplies saved many lives, though the men cursed it at the time. Without it, starvation would have claimed them by the thousands. With it, survival was possible, though never guaranteed. But in the moment, as they hauled load after load up the steep slopes, few thought of survival. They thought only of the pain in their shoulders, the ache in their backs, the endless weight that seemed to have no end. And yet, despite the torment, they did not stop. They rose each morning, strapped on their packs, and began again. The dream of gold burned too brightly to allow rest. Every step was fueled by visions of nuggets gleaming in the pans, of pockets heavy with dust, of lives transformed by fortune. Some sang to keep their spirits alive, their voices ragged but defiant against the wind. Others marched in silence, saving every breath for the climb. but all of them, in their own way, carried not only the weight of supplies, but the weight of dreams, the weight of desperation, the weight of hope. At last, after endless weeks of back and forth, after countless steps carved into the snow and countless loads carried on aching shoulders, the prospectors stood at the top of the Chilkoot Pass. It was a moment that seemed almost unreal. The climb had consumed their days, their strength, their hope, and yet here they were, standing upon the summit of a mountain that had broken so many others before them. For some, it was a triumph so overwhelming that they laughed aloud, their voices thin in the icy air. For others, it was a quiet victory, marked only by a long breath released into the cold. And for many, it was not triumph at all, but a deep and weary relief, the knowledge that one part of the ordeal was finally behind them. The some, it was not a place of rest, though it offered a view that seemed to stretch into eternity. The sky above was pale and sharp, the color of frost. The snow underfoot glittered like ground glass, reflecting the weak light of the northern sun. In every direction, mountains rose like frozen waves, ridges rolling one after another, as if the earth itself had been caught mid-motion. The Yukon lay beyond, vast and wild, its forests stretching like a green and white sea, its rivers winding like silver threads. To stand there was to stand at the threshold of another world, a world both promising and merciless. But the some, it was also a graveyard of dreams. Scattered across the snow and ice were the remnants of countless journeys. Broken sleds, abandoned stoves, bent shovels, cracked pans, all left behind by men too weary to carry them further. Boots lay frozen stiff where their owners had cast them off. Torn sacks of flour spilled white dust into the snow, mingling with the drifts until it was impossible to tell where food ended and wilderness began. There were even crates of bacon, their salt, stained sides gnawed by scavengers, the meat inside left to spoil in the cold. Each abandoned item told a story of exhaustion, of miscalculation, of despair. And then there were the darker reminders. Some said the mountain kept its dead close. Bodies were found half buried in the snow, frozen in place as if still climbing, their faces pale masks, their hands stiff claws. Others were never seen again, swallowed by avalanches, their names remembered only by a few fellow travelers. To stand upon the some, it was to stand among the living and the dead alike, to feel the thin line between survival and loss. Yet for all this, the pass held a strange beauty, a beauty so stark and silent that it was almost holy. The air was so still that every breath seemed to echo. The snow absorbed sound, muffling the cries of men and the creak of sleds, until it felt as though the world itself was holding its breath. Those who stood there felt small beneath the immensity of it all, and yet they also felt a kind of wonder, as though they had stepped beyond the boundaries of the known world. For the gold seekers, this was both an ending and a beginning. Behind them lay the hardest climb they had ever known, weeks or months of relentless labor. Before them stretched the wild expanse of the Yukon, a land untamed, a land that held the gold they sought and the dangers they feared. They knew that the hardest challenges still lay ahead, and yet for this one moment, at the crest of the world, they allowed themselves to feel the fragile light of hope. Some built fires at the summit, huddling together for warmth, their breath curling like smoke into the thin air. Others simply stood and gazed outward, their eyes tracing the ridges, the forests, the distant valleys. In those quiet moments, they allowed themselves to believe that the worst was behind them, that the promise of gold would soon be fulfilled. The some, it was a place of exhaustion, but also of dreams, but dreams were fragile here. The mountain gave nothing freely. A sudden storm could erase the trail within minutes, blinding the climbers and burying caches under feet of snow. The cold was merciless, seeping into bone and marrow, numbing fingers until they could no longer hold a rope or strike a match. The pass demanded vigilance even in triumph. To linger too long was to invite death. And so the men moved forward, step by step, into the unknown beyond. The descent from the sum, it was not the end of hardship. For many, it was merely the beginning of another chapter in a story that seemed without end. The Chilkoot had taken its toll, grinding down bodies and spirits, and yet the land that stretched beyond it made clear that survival was not a single victory, but a daily task. Ahead lay the Yukon, vast and unbroken, its forests black with spruce, its rivers sealed under layers of ice, its silence immense. To look upon it was to feel both awe and dread, for it promised wealth beyond imagination, but also suffering beyond measure. The first steps down the far side of the pass were treacherous. Men staggered under the weight of their packs, their legs trembling, their knees raw with strain. Snowfields sloped steeply, and one misstep could send a climber sliding hundreds of feet, his load scattering like chaff in the wind. The trail wound downward through gullies of ice, over ridges where the wind cut like knives, across hollows where the snow lay deep and uncertain. Many carried loads too heavy for descent, and they toppled, stumbling, cursing, bruised and battered. And yet still they pressed forward, for there was no turning back. The Yukon side of the mountains was a world unlike the coast they had left behind. The air was drier, sharper, filled with the faint resin of pine carried on distant winds. The valleys below lay hushed beneath their winter covering, trees bowed under white weight, lakes sealed in glass. By day the sun shone weakly, never warming, casting long shadows that crawled across the slopes. By night the sky opened into an expanse of stars so clear it seemed the heavens had come down to rest upon the peaks. Sometimes the northern lights shimmered, green and violet curtains drifting across the sky, silent and mysterious. Men paused in their march to gaze at them, weary eyes filled with wonder, their breath rising like smoke as they whispered that it was as though the world itself was alive, as though spirits danced in the frozen air. But wonder could not feed a man, nor warm him, nor carry his burdens. The descent soon led to the great frozen lakes, where prospectors gathered like ants at a crossroads. Lake Lindeman and Lake Bennett became temporary cities, their shores bristling with tents and shacks, the smoke of countless campfires drifting into the cold. Here, after the climb, came the next task, building boats to carry them down the rivers once the ice broke. It was a cruel twist of fate, for after months of toil to cross the mountains, the stampers now had to stop and wait for the long northern winter to loosen its grip. The camps around the lakes were unlike anything most men had ever seen. Canvas tents stood side by side with shelters of spruce boughs and driftwood, their walls patched with scraps of sacking or hides. Inside, men huddled close to stoves or open fires, their breath steaming, their faces hollow with hunger. Supplies were stacked in crude pyramids, flour sacks, bacon crates, barrels of beans and rice, guarded fiercely, for theft was common and hunger drove men to desperate acts. Dogs howled through the night, their cries mingling with the groan of shifting ice and the occasional crack of a rifle. Yet amid the hardship there was life. Blacksmiths set up makeshift forges, hammering out nails and fittings. Carpenters shaped planks, fashioning crude boats from green timber cut on the lakeshore. Traders peddled everything from fresh tobacco to rusty saws, charging whatever price a weary man would pay. Campfires crackled, and around them men told stories, their voices weaving tales of distant gold fields, of fortunes made overnight, of letters from home. Some sang songs to keep despair at bay, their voices drifting into the night like fragile threads of warmth. The waiting was its own kind of trial. Food supplies dwindled faster than men expected. Stomachs shrank and rations grew smaller. Fights broke out over a misplaced sack of flour or over the rights to a certain patch of shoreline for boat building. Sickness spread in the crowded camps, scurvy, pneumonia, fevers that stole the strength from even the strongest. For many, the dream of gold began to waver. They had crossed the deadliest trail, but now they were trapped in the wilderness, caught between mountains behind them and frozen rivers before them. Still, hope held them fast. Each sunrise brought them one day closer to the thaw, to the great release of water that would carry them down the Yukon toward Dawson, toward the gold. They worked ceaselessly, even as hands split and bled from cold, even as backs ached with the strain of sawing and hammering. By lantern light they labored, shaping hulls, driving pegs, binding seams with pitch. In the stillness of the northern night, the sound of hammers echoed like heartbeats across the ice. The landscape itself seemed to watch them. The forests loomed dark and silent, filled with unseen creatures. Tracks of wolves and moose crossed the snow, reminders that life moved here at its own pace, indifferent to human ambition. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the scent of resin, the crack of breaking branches, the distant roll of shifting ice. For the stampers, it was both a comfort and a threat, a reminder that they were small intruders in a land that belonged to the wilderness alone. And always there was the weight of waiting. Some men spoke of turning back, of retracing their steps across the pass, of abandoning the dream before it consumed them. Others scoffed at the thought, swearing they would rather die than face their friends at home without gold in their pockets. Between despair and determination, they lingered day after day, until the ice began at last to show signs of breaking, until the rivers murmured faintly beneath their frozen shells, promising movement, promising release. At last the ice gave way. It began as a whisper, a faint cracking deep beneath the frozen surface, a sound almost too soft to notice. Then came the groans, the deep rumbles, the sharp fractures that echoed across the valleys like cannon fire. The lakes that had held the stampers in their grip all winter long now stirred with the restless power of spring. Ice split into jagged plates, drifting and grinding, breaking free from the shores. Water welled up between the cracks, dark and cold, and the rivers beyond began to move again, first sluggishly, then with a current that could sweep a man away in seconds. For the prospectors who had endured months of waiting, it was a signal more powerful than any trumpet. The road was open, and Dawson lay ahead. The camps at Lake Lindeman and Lake Bennett burst into frenzied activity. The boats, so long in the making, were hauled down to the water's edge. Some were little more than rough boxes hammered together with green timber, their seams sealed with pitch and tar. Others were sturdier, crafted by skilled hands, their hulls smoothed and braced, their oars shaped with care. But whether clumsy or sound, each vessel carried the same weight of hope. Into them went barrels of flour, crates of bacon, sacks of beans, picks, pans, blankets, stoves, tools, rifles, lanterns, and the thousand small necessities that meant survival in the wilderness. Men loaded their gear with careful hands, balancing the weight, testing the ropes, adjusting the lashings, for they knew the river would punish any mistake. When at last the ice broke fully, the fleet of stampers set forth. It was a sight that lingered in memory, hundreds upon hundreds of boats crowding the water, sails of canvas and muslin straining in the wind, oars flashing in the pale sun, voices rising in shouts and calls across the open lake. The air was filled with the smell of pitch and pine, the creak of oarlocks, the splash of paddles, the barking of dogs, the laughter of men who, for the first time in months, felt the sweet rush of movement. They were no longer trapped, no longer stalled. They were bound for Dawson, bound for the Klondike, bound for the promise that had driven them across the mountains and through the snow. But if the river gave them freedom, it gave them danger as well. The lakes themselves were broad and cold, whipped by sudden winds that could capsize a careless boat. The currents at their outlets ran swift, pulling boats into shallows or spinning them against rocks. And beyond the lakes, the great Yukon River gathered strength, carving its way through canyons and gorges, foaming white over hidden boulders, surging into rapids that swallowed boats whole. Men who had never held an oar now found themselves steering through waters that demanded skill and nerve. Some managed with luck, others with steady hands, but many failed. Boats cracked against rocks, their cargo spilling into the icy water. Men clung to planks or vanished beneath the current, their cries swallowed by the roar of the river. Yet the fleet pressed on. By day they rowed and sailed, following the current through bends and narrows, past forests that seemed endless, past cliffs where eagles circled high above. By night they pulled ashore, dragging their boats onto gravel bars or sandy banks, building fires to warm their aching bodies. The camps that dotted the riverbanks glowed with orange light, smoke rising into the northern dusk, voices low and weary. Men lay upon spruce boughs, staring at the stars, their minds drifting between exhaustion and dream. The river was their road now, and it carried them ever forward. The journey was long, stretching for hundreds of miles. The days blurred together, the endless rhythm of paddling, the constant vigilance against rocks and eddies, the biting cold that never seemed to leave the bones. Rain came in sudden bursts, soaking clothes and gear, chilling men to the core. Fog rose from the water, thick and impenetrable, hiding the banks and turning the world into a gray void. Still they went on, because behind them lay too much hardship to abandon, and ahead lay the golden hope that had drawn them from every corner of the world. As they traveled deeper into the Yukon, the wilderness unfolded around them in vast, silent majesty. Forests stretched as far as the eye could see, their dark ranks broken only by silver rivers and pale meadows. Caribou moved across the ridges in long, flowing lines, their antlers rising like branches against the sky. Bears prowled the shores, their hulking forms glimpsed in the twilight, their tracks pressed into the sand near the camps. The air was alive with the cries of loons, the chatter of squirrels, the haunting calls of wolves far in the distance. For men who had spent months struggling step by step across the Chilkoot, the sheer immensity of the land was humbling. It seemed to stretch forever, a kingdom untamed, vast enough to swallow their little boats without notice. And always, in the hearts of the stampers, there was the dream of Dawson. They spoke of it by the fire, their voices hushed and eager, weaving stories of streets lined with gold dust, of men who filled their pockets with nuggets, of fortunes made overnight. Some swore they had friends already there, waiting with claims staked and cabins built. Others confessed they knew no one but trusted that luck would carry them. In the flicker of the firelight, their eyes shone with a hunger that no cold, no hunger, no danger could extinguish. And so our journey through history comes to a gentle close. The voices of the past grow quiet, and the world of today slowly drifts back in. May this story bring you peace as you rest, and may your dreams carry you to calm and restful places. Good night. Sleep well. And if you found comfort here tonight, I kindly invite you to like this video, share it with others who may also drift peacefully into history, and subscribe to join me again for more journeys through time. Until then, may you rest deeply, and may tomorrow greet you with peace.